Hi everybody, welcome to today's video that offers lots of tips for anybody preparing for an NHS leadership interview. Some of you might be applying for your first leadership role as a team leader, for example, whereas others might be applying for a more senior leadership position. And I'll be signposting some key areas to research to help your preparation, potential topic areas for questions, along with some example interview questions. Often you'll have a range of different types of interview questions. You might have some open interview questions at the start, or more technical questions to assess your knowledge, behavioural competency-based scenario questions, or questions like value-based interview questions where you'll need to provide examples from previous practice. So I hope you find this video helpful, and if you do, don't forget to give it a thumbs up on YouTube, and good luck with any interviews that you've got coming up. So what are interviewers looking for in an NHS leadership interview? Interviewers are going to be assessing and evaluating your understanding of the role, the service that you will be delivering, and the organisation and employer that you'll be working with, that you've got the right knowledge, skills, understanding and attitude to be able to perform in this leadership role. They're going to want to know what type of leader you would be and whether your values align with that of the organisation, or they may assess whether your values align with the core NHS values, the 6 C's, or professional values such as those set out within the Nursing and Midwifery Council, and that these values fit into the team and the culture in which you'll be working. So interview questions will be assessing and evaluating these areas in some way. So there is some key background preparation that's going to help you prepare for any leadership interview. Firstly, review the job description. It sounds pretty obvious to do, and lots of applicants will read it once or twice, but you need to really reflect on that job description, on the role responsibilities. Most of the questions are going to relate in some way to the job description, the key service responsibilities, and what you'll be delivering in that role. The job description might even state key national standards or national service frameworks, so you need to become familiar with those frameworks prior to the interview. And it's helpful to highlight key words, terms and headings in the job description and revise them. For example, you might see key headings split into organisation, management and leadership, staff education or staff wellbeing and support, clinical governance or assurance responsibilities, safety or risk assessment. These key headings are a great way to start structuring your preparation. When you're reviewing the job description, you can then reflect on those key responsibilities and think about what sort of questions can come up. For example, if the job description states that your role must ensure statutory and mandatory training compliance across the team, or compliance linked to staff annual appraisals, then you might be asked, how would you plan to achieve this? How would you facilitate staff compliance in relation to annual appraisals? Excuse me. So revise those key terms linked to clinical governance, risk assessment, quality improvement, quality assurance. It might state service evaluation, staff education, support, wellbeing or health promotion. It really depends on the type of role that you're applying for. To answer a question on clinical governance, you need to know what the term means. To answer a question on service evaluation or learning from audit cycles, you need to know how a service is evaluated both internally through audits and externally, for example, through the CQC, the Care Quality Commission. To answer a question on team working, you need to know what the local team structure is linked to the role that you're applying for, what external organisations and agencies linked to that senior role. So reviewing local and external team structures and organisations is also a helpful part of your preparation. You'll also need to review key standards, policies, local and national frameworks linked to the service. Think about how your performance will be measured, for example, in that service. So there might be some NICE guidelines, the National Institute of Clinical Excellence guidelines. There will be national standards and frameworks and service metrics on the NHS performance framework online. If you look at NHS performance frameworks, look at the Department of Health and Social Care, you'll find these metrics on there depending on which specialist area you work in. So for example, in accident and emergency, we've got set target waiting times. It's also helpful to review the Care Quality Commission guidance for providers that states standards for NHS trusts, adult social care and general practice, for example. Another key tip is to try and arrange an informal visit and network with leaders across the service. So you can ask them questions such as, what are the current challenges in the role? How is the team structured? If you can't manage to arrange an informal visit, you might just have a phone call. You may see in the team structure actually provided as part of a job description, but if you're unsure in any way, it's helpful to do a bit of groundwork in that area. You should also review the employer service website to get a feel for the organisation. You can look at what their core values are, look at the NHS values and your professional values as well, just to revise those. I get asked lots of questions about what an informal visit is prior to interview, and I've recently uploaded a video on my YouTube channel that gives you lots of tips, for example, how to book an informal visit, what questions to ask during an informal visit, but also what to do if you can't book one, because sometimes managers are very busy, they can't offer an informal visit, and there's different alternatives you can look at. So do check it out. As I said, it's free on my YouTube channel if you are thinking about booking an informal visit. As I mentioned earlier, it's really important to review current standards, policies, procedures and frameworks that link to the role and the service that you're going to be working for, as they can inform your answers and underpin strategies that you might use. You should be using a current evidence base that links to national standards, for example. And I've just summarised some key areas that might link to your role. Escalation, safeguarding, health and safety. There's lots of resources on the Department of Health and Social Care websites and UK government websites. The risk register, risk assessment is an important area. What risk assessments link to the role, your leadership role? What are you responsible for regarding risk assessment and safety and safeguarding? Instant reporting and investigation of incidents. Patient safety incident response frameworks. It's helpful to talk to colleagues and leaders who deal with investigations and complaints in your current role, for example. If you're asked about a question, there's an increase in complaints in an area and it links to part of your role responsibilities. Talk to people that already deal with complaints in the role that you work in, and you'll gain lots of insights that will help underpin answers to questions. You might not have any of these questions, but they may come up. Also helpful to look at NHS National Service Frameworks, National Institute of Clinical Excellence, NICE guidelines. For example, there's several NICE guidelines for stroke. For example, stroke rehabilitation for adults, stroke and transischemic attack in over 16s. So what frameworks and standards are there linked to the role and the service that you're going to be working in? As I said earlier, Care Quality Commission, they have regulations for service providers and managers and assessment frameworks and evidence categories, so have a look at some of those. And staff wellbeing hubs that provide health and social care colleagues rapid access to mental health services and support where needed. And there's currently a list of services and wellbeing hubs on NHS England website, but also employers will detail those too. So have a look at what's available nationally and locally linked to staff wellbeing and support. To help you revise some of the key terms that might come up in an NHS leadership interview, I've got several free videos on my YouTube channel. These are free resources for anybody to help your interview preparation, so do check them out. They cover areas such as clinical governance, risk management, clinical audit, quality improvement and quality assurance, and clinical incident reporting. So I hope you find those helpful. A few other videos that are free on my YouTube channel that might be helpful. It depends on what type of role you've applied for and what's in your job description. But if your role is to look at nurse education in a leadership role, I've got a simple video overview of key nurse education terms and standards. Also one on quality improvement projects, service evaluations, with some examples from practice, and a video on developing leadership skills in nursing that goes through the difference between management, leadership, lots of different leadership styles. You might be asked a question on what type of leader you are, or a question about leadership styles. And if you haven't done a leadership course as well, it's quite helpful because it links to practical examples. So just they're free resources. So if you think any might help, do check them out on my YouTube channel. So signposted how to prepare, some key websites and areas to prepare for interview questions. So I'm going to start with some generic interview questions linked to the role, the employer, your skills or values. They may be asked in a completely different way in your interview, but you're bound to be asked something about the role, why you've applied, and something about your values and your skills. So I've started with why have you applied for this leadership role. The key here is to be concise, summarising your key attributes, your knowledge and your skill development that led to this application, highlighting key roles that you've had and leadership skills you've developed, the impact of any projects that you've led. Also academic achievements and leadership courses that align to the role, but not just stating that you completed a leadership course, but also stating what did you achieve, what did you do a change management project as part of that leadership course, for example, what impact you had. If you haven't done a leadership course, what have you led, what have you changed, what impact have you had in practice? So highlighting something key that you've led or changed, quality improvement. So always think about the so what in any answer you give. So you might have worked as a staff nurse in the area for 3 years, but so what? Be more specific. What impact did that have? What specific skills did you develop in the role? Another question, that might come up, what are the main priorities or leadership responsibilities in this role? And they're testing to see whether you've really looked at the job description and you understand what the main priorities are. What key skills are required in the role? What do you know about our service and team? So as I signposted earlier, you really do need to know the team structure. What are the service demands? What are you being measured on? They want to know that you understand the demands of the role, the key responsibilities, and you understand the service that you'll be working for. So all the preparation I mentioned earlier, such as reviewing the job description, booking an informal visit, networking with colleagues, talking to people currently in those sort of roles. And you can mention that in your interview, what you learned from networking and informal visits, and the job description. Another question, if you're offered this role, what will you find the most challenging? Or what do you think you need the most support with? Because all people, when they start a new role, will find certain aspects of the role more challenging than other areas. All roles have challenges. So when answering this sort of question, be honest, always state how you will overcome the challenge as well. So for example, although you might find X challenging, I will utilise the support of my line manager and other team leaders to overcome those challenges. Another classic question, why did you apply to this specific trust and employer? Or what NHS values do you prioritise in your current role? And these sort of questions, again, require prior research, looking at what the values are, the mission statement of the trust, what are they well renowned for, what's the ethos, the culture underpinning that employer. And NHS values, it's looking at the 6 C's, for example, and why should we offer you this role above other candidates is another question that often comes up. And here you need to set yourself apart from others and have a concise, strong statement demonstrating your passion, enthusiasm, your core values, skills and attributes. So I'm not going to answer these questions for you. You're much better off not taking off vague answers from the internet. You know, really personalize them and think about your development in relating to these sort of questions. And think about how you would answer these questions. And sometimes it's helpful just to have some key bullet points. So think about the answer. You won't remember everything in an interview, but there might be some key bullet points, some key examples that really show off your skills. So you may have some questions linked to your ability to cope with a leadership role, which can be demanding and challenging. So sometimes you might be asked a question about work-life balance. For example, how do you manage your work-life balance? What strategies do you use to manage stress at work? Because they need to know that you can cope with the demands of that leadership role. The answer is going to be individual to you, but employers expect you to know when you feel stressed and the strategies you use to manage stress and maintain a work-life balance, that you'll ask for help if you're struggling. So reflect on that how you would answer that question, as it's going to be individual to you. Similarly, what strategies do you use to meet deadlines at work? Or it could be, how do you prioritise multiple tasks at work? There's lots of different ways they can pose that sort of question. But it's about knowing how to prioritise short and long-term demands. What is essential and what is non-essential and what can wait? If you're unsure, you utilise manager support. But is there anything that can wait or be delegated? And point out how you do this in your current role. So having an example where you have had a deadline to meet and what strategies you'd used and how you achieved that is really good to inform a question, an answer to that sort of question. So a few more generic interview questions that might come up in an NHS leadership interview. What would be your first 3 key objectives or goals if you were offered the role? Or what would you prioritise first if you were offered this role? So obviously you need to understand what the key responsibilities of the role are, but you need to know what an objective or a SMART goal is, and they should be sort of measurable. And before you can answer that question, and also it's about linking to the job description and those responsibilities. Often initial objectives are to do with communicating across the team, getting to know the team and the teams you'll be working with, for example, internal and external agencies as well. But have a think about how you'd answer that question. What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? Classic interview question. When discussing a weakness, always state how you would overcome the weakness. So for example, you might state you can be self-critical or you've got high standards, but I use others to reflect on my strengths and weaknesses. I use a clinical supervisor as part of my professional development. It's going to be individual to each of you. Another classic question, what are your career aspirations? Where do you see yourself in 5 years' time? Again, this is going to be individual to you. So in an NHS leadership interview, you are often asked questions on communication or collaboration across teams, team working, staff support or performance. So I've just given a few example questions. There may be similar questions that you're asked. You might not get asked these, but they give you an idea of thinking about team working and as a leader how you're going to promote positive communication and collaboration. So first one, how do you plan to promote positive team working in this role? Or it could be to build positive relationships with staff. And to answer this question, you need to be clear that you know which teams and which staff groups that you have responsibility for in this leadership role. As I stated earlier, that's very important. Have you got different staff groups to lead, or is it quite a small team with nurses and support workers? Every role will be slightly different. This is about clear communication strategies and expectations. Are you going to plan to meet all staff one-to-one, or is this not viable as you've got several areas to cover? Will you often offer open listening events or lead wards or team meetings? So reflect on how you answer this type of question in the context of the role that you've applied for. Some other questions might link to be motivating team or staff. So how would you plan to motivate a demotivated staff member? Or it could be a demotivated team even. So I'm not going to answer this for you. There's lots of resources out there offering strategies, starting with ascertaining why they might have lost their motivation using open communication. How would you address underperformance in the service? For example, there may be really poor audit results that have come back. So if you're leading a service, you might get a question on something to do with a target not being met. All services will have metrics for measurement, as I mentioned earlier. So underperformance might link to an increase in complaints or an increase in incident forms, for example. So think about how you're going to address those. How would you manage a staff member in your team who's underperforming? So again, it's important to understand why the person's underperforming. Is it something that's to do with out of work? Can it be dealt with easily and turned around through you supporting that person? Again, you need to ascertain what the issues are. That might be simple or it could be more complex. And again, there's lots of resources out there that you can review to answer this sort of question. Employers will have policies to manage underperformance, staff underperformance, or staff performance, and the use of documented performance improvement plans and reviews so you can put in support to help that person. It's helpful to ask current team leaders and managers that you know, how do they support staff if you're not quite sure? You should also review resources on dealing with a complaint or de-escalation. You may have questions linked to a rise in patient complaints or incidents, as I mentioned. So how would you deal with these issues and reflect on those answers? And as I said, there's clear national and local resources for managing complaints or an increase in incidents in a service. And I've signposted lots of resources earlier, and it's important to learn from these. So check out what your current service, how does your current service deal with increase in complaints? How do they deal with increase in incidents? And as I said earlier, I've got free videos on my YouTube channel going through incident reporting too. You might also find my free video on my YouTube channel, Teamwork in Nursing, helpful to answer questions on teamwork or positive communication. And I've also got a video, how to deal with conflict and incivility, that's helpful if you're a leader and there may be incivility or conflict in a team, for example, that you're leading. So do check them out. They're free on my YouTube channel. So I've got some example questions here linked to quality in healthcare. Often will come up in an NHS leadership interview. How do we measure quality healthcare? What is clinical governance? Quality assurance in healthcare. How do we assure a safe standard of care across our services? Talk me through what risk management is, or what are the 7 pillars of clinical governance? Or they might ask you to talk through one pillar of clinical governance. What is an audit cycle? Or they could say, talk me through an audit cycle you currently use in your role. You may also have technical questions linked to the role and service, such as how would you evaluate the standard of care across a team or across our clinical services? How would you plan to learn from clinical audit feedback to develop the future of this service? So as I mentioned earlier, I've got free videos on my YouTube channel linking to key terms and practical application linked to quality improvement, risk management, audit and service evaluation to answer those types of questions. So now some leadership questions. You might have some specific questions on your knowledge of leadership, such as what's the difference between leadership and management, or what's the difference between a transactional leader and a transformational leader. I've seen the term transformational leadership in quite a few job descriptions recently, so you need to understand, if that term is in a job description, understand what it means. Or what type of leader are you? What is your leadership style? How would colleagues describe you as a leader, or how would colleagues describe your leadership style? So if you've completed a leadership course, you'll probably have already explored these areas, but if you haven't, then do check out my free leadership video on my YouTube channel entitled Developing Leadership Skills in Nursing, where I go through the difference between management and leadership and different leadership styles with practical examples. You might also be asked to talk through an example project that you've led or a change that you've led in practice that positively impacted patient care or staff experiences. So think, before your interview, think about the best example of something that you've led that made a change to either positive change to either staff or patients. So I've got a few scenario-based questions for you linked to leadership, quality improvement. just as example scenarios. You have received, and they might give you some data from clinical incidents and audits. What would your plan of action be? How would you lead a coordinated response to this data? Or a question might be, how would you effectively share this clinical governance data and monitor the situation across the team? So in leadership roles where it's about service delivery especially, it's helpful to network with clinical governance leads in your current role before your interview and ask them, how do they communicate this sort of data as a team, how they learn from governance data, audits and service evaluation. But these are sort of typical questions for leadership roles. Another question, the Care Quality Commission are visiting your service in 2 days' time. How would you prepare and plan for this event? Now, it might not even be the Care Quality Commission in, I don't know, 10 years' time might be disbanded, but there will be external bodies that will come in and check services. So how would you prepare and plan for this event? And as signposted early, the CQC website has current metrics for CQC visits, so have a look at those. Another classic question is, something's happened across the service. It could be a rise in clinical incidents or patient complaints. How would you develop plans to mitigate future risk? Or how would you assure robust clinical governance in this situation? Another key classic question is, how would you plan to embed clinical governance or promote quality compliance across this service? So you need to know what the metrics are, how the service is evaluated regarding quality to answer these sort of questions. And as I said, I've signposted lots of resources earlier. So I've put a few more scenario-based questions here. New equipment's being rolled out across our trust. How would you ensure all registered nurses in your team are trained to use this equipment over the next month? Or a question linked to a decrease in your local education budget, so less staff will have access to continuing professional development funding over the financial year. How would you plan to manage this change across your service to ensure equity for all staff? Another question, due to pressures in A&E, you've been asked to open 2 more beds in your ward. What would you do? So with any of these sort of scenario-based questions where there's going to be a sudden change, interviewers are looking for a structured and systematic approach. So firstly, how would you assess the situation further? Because you need more information. You need to talk to key stakeholders, find out what the rationale is behind this change. Is the change being requested feasible? And then looking at risk assessment for patient safety, and staff safety as well, depending on the sort of type of question. So for example, could safe staffing be maintained if you have to provide 2 extra beds on a ward? Where will the beds go? Is there room on the ward? Is it safe? So how would you assess risk and safety? What would the timescale be? And you're detailing your strategies. Who will lead, implement and monitor progress on any changes like this? So reflect on how you would structure or answer questions if you're asked to deliver change. The structure will be often similar with these sort of questions. You're assessing the situation and rationale. So for example, with the first one, looking at equipment, new equipment, and a decrease in local budget, there's not much you can do. If new equipment needs to be embedded, and there's a decrease nationally of local education budgets, you need to ensure, firstly, if it's new equipment being rolled out, that communication is key, that you've got a clear plan for implementing the education programme that's required, who's going to monitor it and lead it. And again, with the education budget and less staff having funding, and you need to ensure equity of staff, again, it's clear communication strategies, having a process to decide what education's fundamental and essential versus what's not non-essential. So as I said, looking at structuring any of these answers, it's about assessing the situation and rationale before you plan for implementation, and all change must be monitored and evaluated. So sometimes reviewing a change management cycle might help structure these sort of questions, or using API, such as assessment, plan, implement and evaluate, might be a good way to sort of structure an answer to these questions, but it's very much individual to you. But these are some sort of example questions where you might be asked to deal with this scenario-based question. Because lots of leadership job descriptions will include staff support, training and education, I've got a few more questions here linked to that area. So for example, how would you ensure the professional development and learning needs of your team are met? Another question, some staff are complaining that there is a lack of equity when study days are offered to staff. How would you manage this situation? What strategies would you implement to retain staff across this service? How would you plan to support staff wellbeing across your team or across the service? How would you ensure all registered professionals have access to clinical supervision? So have a think about how you might do those questions relate to the job description, or you might devise some of your own potential questions that link to staff support, training and education. So for example, the job description might have preceptorship highlighted in there. But these just to give you a bit of an idea of some potential questions. So I should also mention value-based interviewing, and this is where you're asked for a previous example linked to clinical practice, and the example is linked to a value that's required in the role. So for example, an interviewer might want to ask you a question linked to leadership and the values held in leadership. An example question might be, talk me through an example from clinical practice where you have led a project that's impacted on patient care. Or it could be, give me an example where you've utilised your leadership skills to positively impact staff experiences. And once you give your example, the interviewer will then drill down and ask you more questions about that example. So usually they ask you for one example. So do listen to what the interviewer is asking rather than talking generically about leadership. It will depend on the question. And I do have a value-based interview video free on my YouTube channel that talks through what to expect and how to prepare for these sort of types of questions where you're asked for specific examples in practice. Usually when you're invited to an interview, they will say if you've got a value-based interview, but it's always helpful to think about some case examples that demonstrate a positive impact in your role before any leadership interview. So a time, for example, when you used evidence-based practice or research to impact care, a time when you identified a risk and managed it effectively, or improved care through leadership, or led quality improvement, when you positively promoted teamwork or a collaborative approach, when you enhanced communication across a team, for example, or an example linked to staff education and support, or where you dealt with a challenging situation or learnt from challenges. And either they could be utilised in a value-based interview, but also if you're asked for a scenario, you could also potentially bring in that you have actually dealt with this before as well. But it depends on the question that you're asked. But it's good to have some examples there to draw from. I also get asked a lot about the STAR interview technique to answer questions, because it can be used to help structure an example from past practice that you might use in a value-based interview, for example. So the STAR acronym consists of situation, task, action and result. So you begin by describing the situation concisely, or what the task was that you were given, and what did it involve, or what were you aiming for? What were you aiming for with that task? What was the objective of the task what was the objective in this situation? Then you state your actions, what you did in this situation, and then what the result of those actions were. And that's very important, the result bit, because that's where you'll talk about the outcome. What impact did you have? So although the STAR acronym works very well for value-based interview questions, it does not work for all types of interview questions. So for example, an open-ended question like, why do you want to work here? The STAR technique, isn't really appropriate for that sort of question. The STAR technique really focuses on how you handle the situation and past behaviours rather than technical proficiency. So it doesn't work well for scenario-based questions. What would you do if this happened? Because the interview is testing your technical ability, your approach to dealing with a problem or this challenging scenario. If you were talking through dealing with a challenge and then you wanted to mention that you dealt with it before, you potentially could bring it in, but it's really for if you're asked for an example in an interview or a value-based interview. So do think about the types of questions you're being asked, but it does give you a good structure because it makes sure that you don't forget to talk about the result, the outcome, the impact that you made, which is very important. So some people really enjoy using the STAR technique. Other people find it too restrictive and a bit robotic when you're talking. So it just depends on your style and if it helps you as an acronym to remember or not. So something to consider. So I hope these tips helped in some way. I wish you every success in any future interviews. Don't forget to give it a thumbs up on YouTube and let me know how your interview went.